Sejal Amin. In my role today, I am CTO of Shutterstock. In addition to that, I spend a lot of time hanging out with the VSMC and doing things like this. And in my spare time, I'm also teaching CTOing at NYU's Exec Education program. So all of that keeps me busy, but I've been operating in large-scale product development environments for many, many years now, and I've seen every size and scale there is. But over the years, like many of you, got incredibly frustrated operating in contexts that demonstrated lots of anti-engineering patterns. So things like managing from cost, an increased distance away from the customer or the user, locally optimizing to solve a problem rather than globally optimizing for it, all of those things. And then there's the chasm between product and technology. So I've spent a lot of years trying to better understand how to make that better, and was so very excited last year when VSMC came to life, so immediately raised my hand to participate in the journey with them. So I'm going to skip over this because I don't like pictures of myself. However, last year when I started, we started with an open brief to connect with other CXOs to better understand their value stream adoption, their practices, what their journey was like. And we very, very quickly, with this cohort of people, kind of got to a place where we were talking about cultural inertia and organizational barriers that really prevented the change, right? And so what you're going to hear from me in the next few minutes are 5 barriers and 5 solutions that the team talked about. Now, some of these may seem super familiar to you. They may seem basic, but for the group that was interacting, it was super important for us to talk about this. And I don't know, we spent weeks in what felt like a therapy session until we got to the point that we were actually talking about solutions. So, barrier number 1, short-termism. What do I mean by that? You know, many companies are stuck in that short-term rut because it's really, really hard to make those trade-offs. A lot of companies don't really have that well-developed, well-formed, long-term strategy. And so when you're staring down the neck of a really big change, it feels scary, it feels daunting, it quite honestly just feels too big to tackle. I think the second thing is around sales-led and project-driven models. While leaders and businesses like the sound of the benefits that product-driven models will bring to them, they don't have the patience to wait. And it feels really awkward for them to step back and actually talk about the trade-offs that they need to make for long-term gain because they're not willing to make the short-term trade-offs. And so with short-termism comes a little bit of output obsession. And so I love this graphic because it shows what happens when you have a feature factory and all you're trying to deliver is volume, right? It all becomes about the next release or the volume of features in the release, and you forget about the outcome that you're trying to deliver. And so with that obsession, what happens then is businesses and leaders become super obsessed, quite candidly, with the productivity metric and the productivity conversation over a long-term performance conversation. They're not really having that conversation, and they're not differentiating between the two. Productivity is about short-term, performance is about long-term, and those trade-offs aren't being made. And so for environments who are obsessed with output generation, making those trade-offs for cost-driven leaders. So like CFOs, it feels really, really unnatural to say, you know what, I'm going to slow down a little bit. I'm going to slow down to speed up. The whole idea of taking hands off the keyboards, quite candidly, to do anything else, is an awkward conversation. So let's talk about metrics for just a minute. I have fabulous Brian Finster is sitting next to me, who's going to go next, and he's going to get into the details. But what I will say is that, look, businesses and leaders who are super obsessed with outputs mean that we talked a lot about this in our group, where there are lots of organizations out there still pursuing that single productivity metric. In fact, I'm going to say it was no less than 3 years ago, I was in an organization with a leader where the organization was over 5,000 people, and the ask was to come up with a single performance metric. It was near impossible. Can't do that, right? It's a really, really hard thing to achieve, yes, and I see you shaking your head and laughing, but it was a real thing. And organizations also, as a result of that, lack sort of a multi-dimensional understanding of the products, their customers, their teams, the health of their environment that gives them a well-rounded understanding of what's actually going on in the environment. And then, like I said, Brian's going to cover the misuse part in just a few minutes. But for the companies who, in our conversation that we're using metrics, there was a lot of conversation about leaders using those metrics for conclusions rather than insights for learning and improvement. So business as usual, right? Sure, you all face this. The BAU, keep the status quo going, don't change anything, keep things as they are. There was a lot of conversation amongst this network as well about organizations almost adopting to the chaos that was around them. And people, in fact, thriving in that chaos, if that makes any sense. And so, therefore, it became really, really hard, again, to step back and have that conversation about change. In an environment that was thriving on chaos, there was just no time to do any of that. But where it was possible, the other nuance is the conversation was uncomfortable, especially if it meant having difficult conversations about change in the environment. And so what ends up happening in this environment is that teams, because they're adopting to the chaos, they're forming a bubble. And so what's in that bubble? They're protecting themselves for any kind of outside change because they're adjusting to the chaos. They're finding it's the easiest way to get things done, right? They're protecting themselves from the noise. And so what you end up seeing is an organization just full of bubbles, and it becomes really, really hard to manage all that. So they're optimizing, the point being is that they're optimizing for local success over optimizing for global enterprise success. And I think this was the point or the question that was being asked back there, and we'll talk about it in the solutioning. And the last thing was around tooling complexity. So this was a conversation largely with the people who were based in large enterprises where tools proliferated all over the place, and people just love their tools. They love the tools they brought to the table. They love the processes that they've set up around those tools. But when you're having the conversation about value streams and managing those value streams and measuring those value streams, a tool consolidation conversation is a necessary evil, but it can be complicated and contentious. And again, the global local thing comes in here. The tools are optimizing the team for local success rather than for global success. And the other nuance we covered is where there was a proliferation of tools, and the same kind of tool that existed in a number of places, it could also indicate strategic misinterpretation or lack of alignment across the organization. So, when we were done with all that whining and all that therapy, we finally got to a place where we started talking about techniques and practices that people found successful. Now again, I'm going to reiterate here, the 5 things I say here are probably now groundbreaking. And the first one is, actually Steve touched on it in his talk, right? These are all things you have probably heard about, but again, they were super important for us to talk about in the context of this CXO cohort. So first is psychological safety. This shouldn't come as a surprise to anybody, but it is the job of the CXO to create the right environment. And if you're a CXO who's ready to embark on change, step back and ask yourself the question, is my environment in one in which people are learning, afraid to talk about mistakes? Are they running experiments? Are they information sharing? Are all of those things happening? If they're not, then you probably don't have a great foundation. The other thing is the history of the organization. And what I mean there is if you're in an organization where data was potentially used as a tool or a weapon or as a way to compare teams, those people are not likely to go on their journey with you quickly. Whereas if you have an organization where data was used to help teams and have good and engaging conversations, a really great cycle can emerge from that. And lastly, right, the use of surveys to understand your organization with both qualitative and quantitative data. I mentioned at the beginning of this that I'm the CTO at Shutterstock. What I didn't say is I'm about 40 days into the job, and so about 10 days in, I'll tell a quick story. I ran the Westrum survey, and I guess in my mind, I was expecting to see certain results because of the conversations I had had with people and the information I was given going into the job. And so what I found was apparently the engineering organization extremely generative, like so far to the right that I thought I don't really have any improvement to make. But when I looked closer at the qualitative data and all the survey comments and the lean coffees and the conversations, it was telling me something else entirely. And so I'm still unpacking all of that, but the interesting thing I'm observing is a little bit of the bubble phenomena, where I think teams answered the question about their team and the little environment, the little bubble they operate in, where they're heads down doing work, it feels okay. But the minute that they have to go and interact with another team in the engineering organization, or they have to go interact with someone in the product organization, it doesn't look so healthy, right? And so I'm now trying to figure out how to really understand all of those working practices and what have you, so I can think about what's next. Value stream. So I've heard this, and the whole statement about strategy. If it's not simple, clear, and easy to understand, strategy is weak, right? If you can't communicate it quickly. And strategy is a few key choices. So the point here is start small and scale from there, right? The other thing is around, so if you have that strategy, you've made those decisions, choosing a value stream or a product or whatever it may be in your context, such that it's impactful and you know how to win, and you're better understanding your dependencies, your complexities, what your outcomes need to look like, tying those key results and actions on a roadmap, doing it in small parts, and someone over here said that as well, small things at a time, bite size. And the last point is around designing for context. And what I mean there is every team is operating in a different context. So you're designing the value stream for that team and for what good looks like for that team. You're not designing for purity, and you're not designing for what's best for the organization in the big picture. You're designing for what that unit is doing. Now, there's lots of people in this room, I'm not going to get into much more detail, like Steve over here, who are pros at this, and then I'm sure throughout the day you're going to hear and learn more. Multidimensional measurement. So we talked about measurement and metrics just a few moments ago, but what I want to emphasize here goes beyond just operational measurement, but a bit more about the teams, right? And what I mean by that is, as a leader, better understanding the context of your team, the health of your team, is a really great way to assess organizational performance, how well change is happening, how engaged people are. Combine that with all of the other data that exists in the universe, and gosh, there's so much of it. There's product data, there's value stream data, there's customer data, team data, DORA metrics. I mean, the list goes on and on. The key point is don't overwhelm your teams. I'm doing this now. I've walked into an environment with very little awareness, and so it's one thing at a time. Laying out a roadmap that people can onboard onto, right? And I was just talking with someone this morning about all of these frameworks and how they can be overwhelming. The thing that I like to remind my teams is you don't need to apply them exactly the way they've been described. You may need to adjust for the context that you're operating in, right? And that's where all the magic happens. All the magic happens when you do that. Learning. So as a CXO, it's your job to create an environment that obsesses over learning, right? At the core, that's it. Job one. And so 3 things around learning. So micro changes over big change programs. And what I mean there is that you're teaching the organization to adjust one day at a time, one thing at a time. If you think about it, this applies to your daily lives as well, right? It's how you make changes. You're not making big changes. And a few years ago, same organization that I referred to earlier, we embarked on a large change program that started on January 1st and was intended to end 2 years later. And all along the way, it was really, really hard to know what was going on, and I left the organization before that thing ended, but I knew within 3 months that thing was never gonna work, right? Coaching. So I'm a big fan of coaches. In fact, one of my favorite ones is in the room right here. So what do coaches do? Look, coaches create learning programs that are designed for your organization, for the context your teams are operating in. They understand your business. They're not just pushing things out. It's the difference between a push versus pull. But what's most important is they really understand that they put people at the helm of the change, because at the end of the day, that's who's making it work for you. They're the ones that are pushing the buttons, pulling the levers to encourage them to have those conversations, and their role is to essentially elevate the proficiency of the organization and elevate the performance of the organization. And lastly, managing information flow. I think Steve touched on it earlier. It's your job to figure out how to manage information flow so that context information is getting down to the people that are making the decisions and doing the work, right? So cadence matters, the audience matters, the frequency matters, all of it matters. If you're not paying attention to that, teams quickly lose connectivity to the things that are going on in the big picture. I've seen that happen over and over again, where if information isn't flowing and they're not tied to the strategy, they lose that connectivity, and all of a sudden you have a sea of bubbles. You have a sea of teams that are just working on stuff, but yet they don't understand what their contribution is. Last is education. So look, as a CXO, it's your job to be an active, productive voice, to be a force multiplier for change. What do I want to say here? Top down versus bottom up. So again, you need both. All too often, if you don't have both, what ends up happening in the story over here, engineering teams down here could be making changes, but if there's no push from the top down, or you're not building a partnership with the product organization, your changes get to varying degrees of success. They get blocked from things that are coming from sideways or every which way. And so, look, overall, it looks like the change wasn't successful. So super important that you're engaging in the conversation, you're using language, and you're creating the context for change. And it is a full-on tops-down bottoms-up model. And lastly, look, it's your job. It's your job to keep yourself up to date. And if you're the change champion in your organization, you have to create teaching moments for the people around you. Seek out education, ask for help. And you know what? If you have to go external to ask for help, although that might feel counterintuitive, sometimes you have to do that. And I'm sure many of you have experienced this in your organization. If you are the one saying it on the inside, it feels less credible than if you bring an expert from the outside to say the same thing that you're saying. I mean, hey, if that's what you've got to do, do it. But I'm sure all of you have had that experience at some point in your life. Create those teaching moments. So with that, with the education topic, I'm going to wrap. And so I will obviously, on this topic of learning and education, VSMC has a ton of great learning material out there. You heard Steve talk about some of the things that we're working on next. Get out there and use it. And there's an amazing network of people here as well that obviously know what they're talking about. And I'm sure we're going to have a great conversation. If you are a CXO, please come join our next huddle, because we'd love to hear from you on what your challenges are, if they're different to these, so we can have the conversations around solutioning. Thanks for listening.